Hi folks, some of you guys have been asking me to make a review of my 2021 Commencal Meta TR. As of the recording of this video, me and Corey are just one day away from going on our first trip out of town for the year. Since I don't own a laptop and have no way of making a video while away, I figured this would be a great time to make this video instead of you guys having to wait a couple more weeks. Since I'm making this video in short notice, if you're looking for a vid with cool ride-by shots and all sort of badassery, then this vid isn't it. I just want to get right to it and share my thoughts about the bike. But before I get to it, I just want to remind you guys that pressing the thumbs up early on in the video helps us get more exposure through the YouTube algorithm. So if you guys want to help support the channel for free, you can go ahead and do that. Comments help too, so even just leaving a smiley or something goes a long way. If you want to leave 2 or more comments, that would be awesome. And if you've been watching our channel for a while and haven't subscribed yet, you probably should. That way you don't have to manually check if we have a new vid or not. Just sub and press the notification bell and you'll never miss a new video again. And if you're new to the channel, if you'd consider subscribing as well, that would be awesome. Alright, so this is a 2021 Commencal Meta TR signature. I'm going to be going over the geo and frame of the bike a little bit, talk about the fit and handling, go through some of the spec changes I made and the reason behind them, then we'll go through how the suspension feels, how it reacts on climbs, how it pedals, then how it descends and works under braking at high speed and low speed. Finally, I'll give my overall impression of the bike. For context, I'm 5'9", and this is a medium frame with a 465mm reach. It's a 29er, so it's much longer and bigger than my old 2017 Remedy, but surprisingly, it fits amazingly well. With the steep 78-degree seat tube, when I'm seated, the cockpit feels perfect. When I was first deciding to get the bike, I was concerned it would be too big, but it isn't at all. Pedaling along flat sections and grinding up a climb feels much more comfortable than my old bike. I don't have to lean as far forward as I used to keep my front wheel down, and I can be in a much more neutral position without needing to hang off my bars. This is a bit heavier though, and you can definitely feel it when trying to do even a moderately technical climb. The added weight does come with extra durability though. I don't think anyone needs to worry about this bike snapping in half anytime soon. It also means that the bike feels more stable when it comes time to descend. Off the saddle is when you really start feeling the size of the bike. Coming from a more old school bike that also happened to be a 27.5er, it took a while to adjust to riding in a more forward position to weigh the front of the bike more. Otherwise, the rider could possibly lose traction on the front tire in flat turns, and you don't really need to lean back as much when braking with the slacker head angle and longer front of the bike. It's best to stay pretty neutral if you want to keep tire marks off your butt, especially in the steep. This probably isn't an issue for taller riders, but if you're of average height, it's something to keep in mind. I'd love to see a mullet version of this bike in the future. Otherwise, it feels surprisingly easy to maneuver for a bike this long and slack. I really enjoyed the geometry of the bike, and I haven't for a second thought of going back to old school geo. Although I wouldn't push it any further than this. As such, I would not recommend upsizing on this bike. I would stick to the recommended size for your height. On a side note, with a piggyback shock there's very little room for a water bottle. I had to use a magnetic bottle cage paired with an adapter to get the bottle low enough to fit. This probably isn't an issue on larger sizes or if you run a non-piggyback shock, but I figured I'd let you know. In regard to the spec of the bike, for the most part, it's a dream build. You get the top of the line Kashima-coated Fox 36 and Float X2, so all of the bling. You get 140mm of travel in the rear, and on this signature build you get 160mm of travel in the front, making the bike have a 64-degree head angle as opposed to a 64.5 if you run it with a 150mm fork. You also get a great all-mountain DT Swiss wheel set with 350 hub, although I would have preferred 6-bolt hubs over center lock to give me more rotor options without needing adapters. I love the WTB Silverado saddle that came with the bike, definitely my new favorite saddle. The Shimano XT 12-speed drivetrain has been working like a dream. I love how it shifts under load, especially when climbing. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of Magura brakes. They've been flawless for me and I can always get a perfect bleed on them, so I transferred over my MT7s with HC3 levers because the stock Shimano 2-piston brakes just didn't cut it. I paired my brakes with Magura MDRP rotors 203 front and rear using DT Swiss adapters. Right away, I swapped out the 150mm KS lev dropper for a 210 1-up dropper with a wolf tooth lever. It fits perfectly. Slammed almost all the way, it raises up to my perfect pedal height, and when it comes time to descend, my saddle goes as low as it could possibly go. I love that I can do this on a medium frame. It gives me all the room to maneuver the bike without worrying about the saddle getting in the way. So if you have a 32-inch inseam, now you know that you can go ahead and get yourself a 210mm dropper and that it will fit. I'm a little disappointed the medium came stuck with a 150. I mean, it's the 2020s, and all mediums should come with at least 170mm of drop. Back at the cockpit, I trimmed my bars down to 760. This is my preference, I just feel like that's the widest I can go before compromising my range of motion. Also, I'm sticking with the stock 50mm stem to make sure I keep my weight over the front. And even though the stock grips were okay, I swapped them out with my preferred ODI Rogues. I have large hands for my height, and anything thinner just makes my hands go into rigor mortis. The bike came stock with Maxxis dissectors, great tires for general trail riding, and I love them on my Meta hardtail, but I felt like they were a little undergunned for the type of riding I'm interested in doing with this bike. As such, I went ahead and swapped them out for a DHF-DHR2 combo for all-purpose riding. I'm a flat pedal rider, so I went with ADT Max this time, and boy are these things great. Solid platform with a ridiculous amount of grip. I feel super secure on these going down chunk, while still having the peace of mind knowing that I'm not going down with the ship if things go sideways. Now these last two changes are related to the characteristics of the suspension. As some of you may know, chainring size has a very direct effect on anti-squat and pedal feedback on a single pivot bike. Don't let all these pivots and linkages fool you. The suspension is linkage driven, but it's still a single pivot. When I swapped out the chainring for an absolute black oval, I upsized to a 34 tooth. And although the 170mm cranks felt perfectly fine to pedal with, I downsized them to 165. Before I explain why, let's talk about the stock characteristics of the suspension. Going uphill, the bike feels super efficient to pedal. I read somewhere that the anti-squat goes up to 150% and stays above 100% for most of the travel across the total gear range. The performance definitely reflects that. As such, you'll probably need little to no compression damping. The anti-squat is so high that it feels like a hardtail when pedaling, albeit a very heavy hardtail. This is a great characteristic if you're grinding up gravel roads for ages, but when things get technical, the rear can occasionally get hung up on square edges like roots and rocks. On an XC bike, this isn't an issue because they're super light, but with a very heavy bike, having stiffer suspension doesn't make it the best technical climber. Of course, this isn't what this bike was meant for. It's meant to grind up the road and then bomb down a trail at Mach Chicken, so this really isn't a complaint, it's just more of an observation that I thought I'd share. Going downhill, the bike feels very stable and composed at speed. The rear suspension feels very supportive, even with the compression damping completely open. I did have to add a second token to the fork to balance it out with the rear though. With one token and running 18% sag, the fork felt like it was going through a lot more travel relative to the rear at 30% sag. But I wanted to keep that sensitivity in the front, so I opted for progression as opposed to damping or a firmer spring rate. I'm gonna be honest here though, I definitely felt a lot more feedback through my pedals when going through rough chunk versus my old Remedy. Running the rear as soft as I could without going lower than 30% sag, the rear still felt very firm at moderate speeds. It was only when I really let the bike fly that the rear suspension came to life. Perfect for the speed demons out there, so the bike is definitely more on the sporty end. When it came time to jump the bike, this firm characteristic felt great, very predictable and supportive. So much so that anyone I lent the bike to that knew how to actually jump a bike, unlike me, could fly like an eagle right off the bat. When going down technical trails, the Geo of the bike gives a ton of confidence. It feels like you can get away with some pretty bad line choices. One thing I didn't like is when going down a steep section with a sudden compression at the bottom, I felt like my feet kept getting bucked off. There are sections I've ridden with my Remedy dozens of times where this was never an issue, but suddenly with the Meta TR, it is. I suspect this is an inherent characteristic of single pivot bikes with high anti-squat, but I'm not an engineer, so I can't be sure. Speaking of single pivots, another thing about them is there is no separation of braking forces from the suspension, so when you use the brakes, the suspension locks up. On the one hand, your rear suspension doesn't rise, so you don't have to lean back as much to counter going over the bars during hard braking. On the other, if you're going over a very chunky section and want to scrub some speed before an upcoming turn, or you just don't want to go too fast and you're dragging your rear brake, your suspension is going to get very stiff and the ride is going to feel very rough. You're definitely going to feel it in your ankles and wrists. If you're a hardcore speed demon that never uses the brakes, this isn't an issue. So again, this hints at this bike being meant to be ridden hard, or casual riders might find this bike a little harsh. This is the price to pay for a super durable single pivot bike built like a tank. If you're looking for a bike with suspension that stays active while braking, you might want to look into a concentric pivot bike like Trek's ABP or 4-bar and its other variants. Personally, I think riding a single pivot bike for a while will make me a better rider and force me to let off the brakes a little bit more and work on improving my handling of the bike as opposed to just slowing down whenever I get a little scared. Anyway, back to why I went with a larger chainring and shorter cranks. On single pivot bikes, going up a chainring size can reduce anti-squat by up to 5 to 10% across the board of travel and gearing. Going down has the opposite effect, so if you have a single pivot bike that is too bobby on the climbs, downsizing your chainring can reduce that. So I did that in an effort to allow the bike suspension to be a little more active on climbs, and hopefully more active in general. Of course, my bailout gear isn't going to be as easy now, but there's also a secondary benefit to a larger chainring on a single pivot. If you have a larger chainring, it also reduces the effect of pedal kickback, so when I hit that sudden compression next time, the cranks will rotate back to a lesser degree. On top of that, having shorter cranks means that my pedals move a shorter distance for a set amount of rotation. Having those two things working in tandem should make a significant difference when it comes to pedal feedback and kickback bucking me off my pedals. So what do I think of this bike? Well, I love the geometry, and I'll definitely be sticking to bikes with a similar geo for the foreseeable future. Overall, the spec is amazing for a bike that I got for just a little over 4K. The only disappointing thing about the spec are the undergun brakes and tires. I feel like a hard charging bike like this deserves better. Also, the bike has a very sporty feel and requires a very fast and aggressive rider to make the most of it. Casual riders going at a more moderate pace might find the bike a little harsh. Other than a couple nitpicks that I had with pedal feedback, I still think that this is a great bike for the money. So, those are my honest thoughts about the bike. I hope you guys found this video useful and or informative, and I'll also be letting you guys know how the shorter cranks and larger chainring work out in the future, so stay tuned for an update. Anyway, I gotta get packing for that trip, so I'll be seeing you guys in at least a couple weeks. Stay safe out there, folks.